Hello folks, my name is Tomas Rotta. I'm a lecturer in economics at Goldsmiths, the University of London, and in this video lecture I want to give you a taste of the kind of lecture that we give here in economics at Goldsmiths. I guess you guys are interested in joining our department. We have very nice programs, and so I have prepared here, as you can see, a lecture on a special topic that I want to teach you. But before I do so, I just want to show you who is talking to you, who is going to give this lecture, me. So you can go to the IMS webpage on the Goldsmiths website. It's this address that you can see right here. If you scroll down a little bit, you click on staff. You're going to see the list of the full staff of the department. Everybody is here, around 40 people, 40 members of the permanent staff. If you scroll down a little bit more, you can see me here, Tomas Rotta, as I said before. You can see a picture of me. If you click here, you can go to my page. I am currently teaching advanced econometrics for the 3rd year. I also teach applied quantitative economics for the 2nd year, and I'm also supervising students in their whole journey at Goldsmiths in years 1, 2, and 3. So now you have a better idea who is talking to you, who is going to give this lecture, and we are ready to start. So let me go back to my presentation. I'm going to open it. All right. So the title is, why does the economy grow or shrink? Okay. And this question is important because most people would answer this question in the following way. Oh, wow, the economy grows because we produce more stuff. But that answer is not correct. Why? Because even though we can produce more stuff, that's not enough for the economy to grow. If we produce more stuff, but people are not buying that more stuff that we have produced, GDP is not going to grow. The economy is not going to grow. So it's not enough to say that we have produced more. Because if people don't buy what we have produced, if companies don't buy more inputs, people don't buy more consumption goods, the economy is not going to grow. So production is not enough to make sure that the economy grows, okay? So let's see why exactly the economy grows and why it doesn't grow. So why does it shrink sometimes? One example is right now. Right now the economy is shrinking. So we know that GDP can fall sometimes, but most of the time GDP tends to grow over time, okay? There's a growing trend in GDP, okay? But why? What is the reason? Why does GDP grow or fall over time? Okay. So if you look at the data, this is nominal GDP. This data is on the internet. You can just Google it. Okay. So that's nominal GDP. You can see the nominal GDP for the world there, and that's the blue line. Yellow line, you can see the GDP for Europe and Central Asia. The United States is also there. The red line. You can make as many plots as you want. This data is easily available on the internet. There I put Germany, France, the UK, and Russia. You can compare the nominal GDPs. What do you see? These economies grow, and it's more than growth. They grow exponentially, okay? So now I put the United States together with Germany, France, the UK, Russia, and Canada. So what do you see? It's not just growth, it's exponential growth, okay? GDP, which is a measure of the economy, okay? It measures value added, as we're gonna see. GDP grows and it grows exponentially, okay? So you can see right here that sometimes GDP does not grow, it falls, so the economy shrinks, as you can see. After the 2008 crisis, the economy has shrunk. But after a while, it keeps, growth comes back and the economy keeps increasing. So it grows and it grows exponentially, okay? Is it because of inflation? Is GDP growing because of inflation? The answer is no. Let's deduct inflation from the data. And what do you see? Now we have the world GDP, we have the GDP for the United States, UK, and Europe and Central Asia together. And here I have deducted inflation, so now we are talking about real GDP, and real GDP keeps increasing, okay? If we remove the world, so now you only have Europe, and Central Asia together, US and the UK, you can see the real GDP keeps increasing. So it's not because of inflation. I just removed the inflation and GDP keeps increasing, okay? And it increases systematically, even though if you look at here, as I said before, after the 2008 crisis, GDP actually fell, but over time, the trend is positive, okay? Does GDP grow because of population? Some people say, GDP is just growing because the population is growing, but that's not true. Because if we deduct population growth, take a look, the economy keeps increasing, okay? So here we have real GDP per capita. So this is GDP, you deduct inflation, so you get real GDP, then you deduct population growth. So this is the real GDP deducted, inflation was deducted, and then per capita, per inhabitant. And still, what do you see? The economy is increasing systematically, despite a few years in which it shrinks. But systematically it grows, and it grows a lot, okay? So this is the GDP per capita, real GDP per capita of the United States. It's the country with the highest one here. The UK comes next, then Europe and Central Asia, and that's the average for the entire world economy. You can also put many countries together, so you're going to see that the United States and Canada are at the top, then you have Germany, France, the UK, Italy is not doing well, Spain is not doing well, and Greece is doing much worse. Here you have some developing countries like Chile, Venezuela, Turkey, Brazil, Russia and Argentina. You can clearly see that the Greek economy has been shrinking so much that is actually approaching the levels of developing countries in Latin America. All right. So this is a clear case of a first world economy whose GDP has been shrinking so much that it's approaching a much less developed economy like Chile in Latin America. Okay. Is the GDP growing because of exports? Some people say, oh, our economy is growing because of exports, right? But that's not the reason why economies grow, because one economy's export is another economy's imports, okay? So the world as a whole is also growing. World GDP is growing, but the world is not exporting, right? So even though individual countries can grow because they export, like if you take China, if you take Germany, these countries, they, of course, individually, they can grow because they are exporting. But the world economy as a whole, well, as far as we know, it's not exporting to other planets, right? We are not exporting to Mars or to the moon, and nobody is buying from us, right? But still, so the world economy is not exporting to anyone else. Imports and exports for the whole economy together, if you sum all of them, they have to sum to zero, okay? Because one's exports are somebody else's imports, and vice versa, okay? If you're importing, your imports are somebody else's exports. So if you sum all the imports and exports on the planet, you're necessarily going to get zero, okay? So for the world economy as a whole, net exports are zero, okay? So if you look at the world economy cannot export, okay? We are not exporting to other planets so far. But still, the world GDP keeps increasing, you see? The world GDP keeps increasing and it's not exporting to anyone else. So GDP grows, but in the aggregate, it's not because of exports, okay? So it's not because of inflation, it's not because population is growing, and it's not because of exports, okay? In this graph, I have summarized everything. Why? Look, real GDP. So inflation was netted out. Population was netted out because we are talking about per capita real GDP. And exports have been netted out because this is the world GDP, and the world economy is not exporting to anybody else, okay? So let's look, at the reason now, the real reason why GDP is growing, okay? Big question, why does GDP rise or fall? So let's take a look at the answer, okay? So first, we need to know something from national accounting. GDP is equal to the expenditures, to the total expenditures on final goods. And GDP at the same time is value added, the value added in the economy. Usually it's measured in years, but you can measure by quarters too. And GDP at the same time is also a measure of the incomes of productive factors, okay? So GDP is equal to these three things at the same time. So these three things, they have to be equal, okay, at any point in time. So I'm going to put these equations here into one single equation. So the expenditures here, I put them on the left, and the incomes on the right, and the value added in the middle, okay? We can break down expenditures into their two subcomponents, main subcomponents, okay? Consumption and investment. Basically, there are only two types of expenditures, consumption and investment. You're going to learn that we have consumption, investment, government expenditures, then exports minus imports. It doesn't matter because all of them boil down to two, consumption and investment, okay? Because imports and exports, government expenditures, they all either mean government consumption or government investment, and you export or you import for consumption or for investment. So basically there are only two categories of expenditures, consumption, investment. Anything is going to fall into either one of these two categories. It's either for consumption or for investment, okay? Then we can break down incomes on the right hand side in terms of wages and gross profits, okay? Wages of those who are working and profits for the companies hire them, okay? So I'm going to put that equation into a table, okay? So GDP in the middle, value added. On the left, expenditures, which are consumption plus investment. On the right hand side, I'm going to have incomes, wages plus profits. And I'm going to make up the numbers, okay? So we have 3 years there, and I'm going to make up the numbers because I just care about the principle behind, okay, the numbers actually don't matter. So let's suppose that in 2012, the GDP in the UK was 2 trillion, okay? So if you look at the data, you're going to see that for the same year, expenditures are 2 trillion, and then incomes are 2 trillion too, okay? For the same year, these three numbers, they have to be the same, okay? But then an amazing thing happens. When you look at the data for the next year, 2013, you're going to see that GDP in the UK is 3 trillion pounds, okay? So how is that possible? GDP was 2 trillion, but now it's 3 trillion. And you say, oh, the economy is growing because we are producing more. Yeah, but who is buying that stuff, that extra stuff, you know, that more that we have produced, that extra stuff that we have produced? Because if you look on the right-hand side here, incomes are 2 trillion. So this is what people have in their pockets. They have 2 trillion. But now we are producing 3 trillion, but people only have 2 trillion in their pockets. If you only have 2 trillion in your pocket, in terms of total income, how can you buy these 3 trillion pounds that were produced in terms of value added in the next year? You see, there is not enough money to buy because at the end of this year, people had this in their pocket. How can they buy more that is produced next year, okay? So how do we jump from 2 trillion to 3 trillion here, okay? And then the same is going to happen the following year. Because in 2014, let's say, GDP rises to 4 trillion. So if people only had 2 trillion in their pockets, how can they have enough income to purchase, you know, a growing level of production, okay? As I said before, it's not enough to produce stuff. Because if we produce more stuff and nobody's buying that stuff, GDP is actually not increasing. So we need to make sure that we're producing and people are buying that stuff, okay? So the answer is the following. You have to look at this table from the left to the right, okay? Instead of looking at the table from the right to the left, don't look at it from incomes to expenditures. You have to look from the left to the right. The causality here, causality goes from the left to the right, from expenditures to incomes, okay? Then you're going to understand how is it possible that people with 2 trillion can produce and then purchase 3 trillion, okay? So for 2013, we need to have the same numbers in the 3 cells, right? So for the same year, these 3 numbers are the same here, okay? And here we're going to have 4 and 4, okay? How is it possible for these numbers to grow here, for the economy to grow? What happens is the following. Here, companies and people and the government together, they were spending 2 trillion to produce 2 trillion, and they got back, in terms of incomes, 2 trillion. Okay? The next year, they're going to spend 3 trillion to produce 3 trillion to get back 3 trillion. Okay? So the trick here is, how do we go from this 2 trillion in terms of incomes to 3 trillion in terms of expenditures the next year? Because the same is going to happen in 2014. Okay? The same is going to happen the following year. We have, at the end of this year, 3 trillion in our pockets, but then the economy is going to spend 4 trillion to produce 4 trillion in terms of the values of the goods and services, and then we're going to pocket 4 trillion, either in terms of wages or profits for the companies, okay? So how can we jump from 3 trillion pounds in terms of incomes to 4 trillion in terms of expenditures the next year, okay? How do we jump from 3 to 4 or from 2 to 3? The principle is the same, okay? So what do we know so far? Look, this is very important. At any point in time, okay, any point in time, for a day, for a month, for a week, for a quarter, for a year, okay, this equality is always true. Expenditures, they're equal to incomes. T is the time subscript, okay? For the same T, for the same, as I said, for the same week, for the same month, for the same year, expenditures must match incomes, okay? And incomes must match expenditures. They must be the same, okay? But GDP grows because expenditures are greater than incomes, okay? GDP is growing because in the next year, or the next month, or the next day, or the next week, the next quarter, it doesn't matter, in the next time period, expenditures are going to exceed total income, okay? So if we break down, as we had before, expenditures, we can break it down in terms of consumption plus investment. So this is consumption next year, investment next year, or next month, or next quarter, it doesn't matter, okay? And the incomes that we have now. Wages now, profits now, okay? So this is the reason why GDP grows, okay? GDP grows because consumption plus investment in the future is greater than wages plus profits right now, okay? Then in the future, next week, next month, next quarter, or next year, this equality here is going to be true again, because it has to be true all the time, okay? Notice here it's T and T, T plus 1, T plus 1. But here it's across time, you see, T plus 1 and T. So at any point in time, for the same year, same week, same month, same quarter, this is true and this is true, okay? This is true because this is true. But across time, you can have this. If expenditures are greater than incomes, GDP grows. If expenditures are equal to incomes, then GDP does not grow, it stays the same. Growth is flat, okay? No growth. And of course you can have the opposite. What if expenditures are less than incomes, okay? Then GDP is going to shrink, okay? So GDP falls when we have this. If expenditures are lower than our incomes, then GDP is going to fall, okay? So if consumption plus investment in the future is lower than what we have right now in our pockets, then GDP is necessarily going to fall, necessarily, okay? Going to fall. So again, if expenditures are lower than incomes, GDP falls. If they're the same, GDP does not grow and does not fall, it stays flat, okay? And if expenditures are greater than incomes, then GDP increases, okay? And remember, for any point in time, they have to be equal. But across time, they can differ. And this difference is what determines if GDP grows, if it stays the same, or if it falls, okay? But, now let's go deeper into it, okay? How can we spend more than our income? The answer is credit, okay? And because we have two types of expenditure, we're going to have two types of credit. So if we have investment and consumption, we're going to have investment credit and consumption credit, okay? So what do we know so far? So GDP grows over time because expenditures are greater than incomes. This is the reason why GDP grows, okay? And expenditures can only exceed incomes if there is credit, okay? So what do we know? No credit, no growth, okay? But there's a problem because credit is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for growth, okay? The fact that we have credit doesn't mean that we're going to have growth. What I said is, if there is no credit, there cannot be growth. But if there is credit, we don't know for sure if we're going to have growth, okay? So credit is what allows expenditures to be greater than incomes, okay? If we don't have credit in the system, if banks are not creating credit, then there is no way for expenditures to be greater than incomes, and there is no way for GDP to grow, okay? So let's go one step further. Where does credit come from, okay? I'll give you a hint. It's not from deposits. Even though many people believe that credit comes from deposits, that's not true. That's absolutely not true. Credit does not come from deposits, okay? Credit does not come from previous savings either, okay? Many people believe in this, that credit originates from deposits or previous savings, but that is not true, okay? The origin of credit, it's not in deposits, not in previous savings, okay? Some people say the government is the origin of credit. Well, that's not true. The government can create credit. That's true. The government can do it. The government can use the central bank to create credit. But if you look at the data, usually 97% of the total credit in the economy actually comes from private banks, not from the government. So only 3% comes from the government, or even less. Sometimes it's less than 3%. Okay, so the vast majority of the money in circulation, money and credit, comes from private banks. It's the private sector that is creating all of this credit. Okay, so how does it happen? Okay, so the answer is commercial banks. Commercial banks create money out of nowhere, literally out of nowhere. Okay, they just type the numbers on the computer, and here I put in bold letters commercial banks because we have to say commercial banks, okay? Because investment banks cannot create money out of nowhere, okay? Basically, the difference is commercial banks, they have a checking account at the central bank. And if you have a checking account at the central bank, you are allowed to create money out of nowhere. And investment banks, they don't have a checking account at the central bank, okay? But what determines, let's go one step further, okay? So what determines how much credit is actually created, okay? And the answer is, what determines how much credit is created is the commercial bank's expected profits, okay? Banks are going to assess risk and return when they create money out of nowhere, when they create credit, okay? Well, remember, this money creation is a liability to the bank, because some people could say, oh, if banks can create money out of nowhere, how can they go bankrupt? Because we do see that banks go bankrupt, but if they are just creating money out of nowhere, how can they go bankrupt? They just create money for themselves, and that's not true, because when the bank is creating money out of nowhere, it is creating money out of nowhere to someone else, to another bank, to another company, or to the government, or to consumers. So the bank cannot create more money for itself. The bank can only create more money out of nowhere to other people, okay? So every time that a bank creates money out of nowhere, credit, it's a liability to the bank. So the bank is creating money and it's increasing the liability of the bank, the liability side, okay? And because it's a liability, of course, you can go bankrupt, right? So if you create money out of nowhere and the people don't pay you back, You have a liability and you have no matching asset, so you go bankrupt, okay? Your net worth, the capital of the bank turns negative, and then that's when the bank goes bankrupt, okay? So as I said before, bank credit does not come from previous savings. Bank credit does not come from deposits. The opposite is true, okay? Deposits come from bank credit, and savings come from investment finance with bank credit, okay? It's the opposite. It's not that you have savings and then savings become loans to other people. No, it's the loan that creates the savings, okay? It's the credit that creates the deposit, okay? Because at any point in time that you ask for credit, the bank creates a checking account for you, or the bank is going to deposit money in your checking account, okay? So it's credit creation that is actually creating the deposit, not the other way around, which means that the money multiplier does not exist, okay? Many people, if you're taking your A-levels, I don't know, maybe you have heard about the story, the money multiplier, that people go to the bank with their deposits, they deposit their money, so their savings are at the bank, and then the bank takes that money and they're going to make loans to other companies and consumers. So you go from deposits to then, the banks, they gather all these savings together, they make loans, but that's not true. That's absolutely not true. That's not what banks do. They don't do that. They're not loaning your money to other people, okay? So the money multiplier does not exist. The money multiplier story is this. People deposit money, then you have the fractional reserve system, and then the bank can, use, let's say you deposit like £1,000, and then the bank only needs to keep like 10% of this, so then it can loan 900 and then so forth. So you have this money creation because you have a fractional reserve system, but that's absolutely incorrect. That's not how the system works, okay? One step further, how do companies decide how much to invest, produce, and hire, okay? So companies, basically that's the answer. Companies decide how much to invest, produce, and hire. This decision is based on their expected profits, okay? And banks are going to do the same, okay? How do banks decide how much credit to create in order to finance companies' expenditures? The answer is banks decide based on their expected profits, okay? So the whole private sector, banks and companies, they're both making decisions about how much to produce, how many people to hire, how much to invest, and then the banks are making the decision about how to finance those investments. It's all based on expected profits, okay? Companies are not going to invest, they're not going to produce, they're not going to hire more people if they don't expect to make a profit. And banks are not going to loan more money, they're not going to create credit out of nowhere if they don't expect to make a profit out of it. So expected profits is what drives the system, it's what drives the private sector, okay? Companies are not going to produce, they're not going to hire anybody, they're not going to invest in anything if they don't expect to make a profit out of it. And banks the same. If they don't expect to make a profit out of a loan, they're not going to create a loan, okay? So expected profits determine how much companies produce, how much they hire, how much they invest, and it also determines how much credit banks are going to create, okay? So the main driver of GDP growth or GDP fall in the private sector is expected profits. Okay, that's a key term. Expected profitability determines how much companies are going to produce, hire, invest, and how much credit is going to be created out of nowhere by the commercial banks. Okay. So just one last point, okay? So what about the government, okay? Because I mentioned the private sector, okay? I focus so much on the private sector for one simple reason. 97% of the credit in the economy comes from private banks, okay? Very little of it, maybe 3% or even less than 3% actually comes from the central bank, from the government, okay? So, but the government is different, right? Because the government doesn't actually have to obey the principle of expected profits, okay? The government can hire, the government can produce, the government can invest, not based on expected profits. The private sector, banks and companies, they care about expected profits because if they don't do it, they're going to go bankrupt. But the same does not apply to the government, okay? The government can follow a different logic, which is not the pursuit of profits, okay? So the government can spend, hire, produce, and create credit without worrying about expected profits. Okay, the government can step in to spend more when the private sector spends less. The government can step in to create liquidity when banks reduce credit. And now with the coronavirus crisis, it's exactly what we are observing. The private sector is shrinking. They're not hiring people. They are making employees redundant. Private banks are reducing the amount of liquidity in the system. They are destroying credit. So when you hear the newspaper saying, oh, there is liquidity destruction, there is less liquidity in the system, there is a liquidity crunch, what that means is that banks are destroying credit. Okay, but the government can step in, the central bank can step in this, let's say, extreme times like we are living through right now, and the bank itself can create liquidity, it can create credit out of nowhere, and it can spend more to compensate for the fact that the private sector is shrinking, okay, because of the crisis. So in times of crisis, the government usually uses its ability to spend more and create more credit, okay? So that's it. Thank you very much for watching this video taster lecture. If you enjoyed the taster lecture, you can find more information, or please, join our economics programs. More information at this address, gold.ac.uk/economics. And well, I hope to see you around on campus. I hope you join our programs, and I'm also available. You saw my webpage. So you can email me if you want, if you have more questions too. All right. So that's it, folks. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.